Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this joint meeting of the Social Affairs Policy Review Committee and the Constitutional Legal Affairs and Justice Committee. I'm Anne Corlett, MHK, Chair of the Social Affairs Policy Review Committee, and with me is Mr Tim Glover, MHK, a member of that committee. Also, we have today Mrs August Phillips, Chair of the Constitutional Legal Affairs and Justice Committee, and Mr Hooper and Mr Peters, members of that committee. So today we're meeting with the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs, Chief Officer for the Department of Home Affairs, and the Prison Governor. So welcome to this annual oral evidence session, and for the benefit of Hansard and anyone listening, could you please introduce yourselves, including your title and how long you've been in post?
Yes, thank you for the welcome. Chair, I'm Jane Poole-Wilson, Minister for Justice and Home Affairs, and been in post, I think, for 4 years, 4 months.
Good afternoon, my name is Dan Davis. I'm the Chief Officer for the Department of Home Affairs, and I have been in post since July 2018. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leroy Bonnick. I'm Head of Prison and Probation, and I've been in post since June 2021 as the Permanent Governor.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll let Mr Glover start, I think.
When we met last year, you told us that the department had introduced quarterly meetings with the heads of service to report performance data and delivery on projects. Have they continued, and what benefits do you think they bring?
Yes, they have continued, and they're a really important part of the department's governance processes. We get really quite detailed reporting actually from the largest service areas, from the Isle of Man Constabulary and from the Prison and Probation Service. What that does is it allows us to then have quite what I would call constructive and detailed discussion with those service areas on a quarterly basis. So we can, and actually what we're trying to do, what I should say is, the reporting itself, the detail that we're getting, remains to some extent a work in progress, because we are keen to make sure that the information we get is useful data. I mean, there's a vast amount of information we could ask for, but we're keen that the information we do get is useful data that we can explore and that is meaningful to the department, that enables us to track trends. So, for example, if I was thinking of the constabulary, from quarter to quarter you might see fluctuations in the numbers of cases coming forward around sexual assaults. The percentages change might look quite large, that might make you ask a question as to what's going on, but actually when you look at the underlying numbers, they may not be changing that much. And actually there's a slight danger that you over dig into something from quarter to quarter instead of looking at overarching trends. And that's why I would say the meetings are useful, because we can unpack and explore things with the service heads, but we are mindful that we shouldn't necessarily latch onto a policy decision or adjust a process off the back of a quarter-to-quarter trend, that it's much better to compare year on year and really start to build a picture of, for example, is the nature of offending changing? When we talk about prison and probation, is the profile of the prison population changing? How are interventions making a difference? So those reporting meetings are extremely useful for us. And one more thing I would say, I haven't mentioned the other service areas, but for example, fire and rescue. It's extremely helpful for us to see things like overall demand. Overall demand, by and large, hasn't shifted hugely. What is very interesting is the ability to break down within that demand what that demand is made up of. And through that, we can see more special services responses are happening in fire and rescue. And in particular, one of the trends we've seen is first responding, for example, to cardiac arrests. And so we know then that not only are fire and rescue trained people doing more of that work, but then that prompts a discussion, for example, with the Chief Fire Officer around the level of training, the type of training and the type of support that the fire and rescue service are receiving, and is that keeping in line with the changing nature of demand? I could talk a lot more about the benefits of these, but I hope that gives you a flavour.
I think just to add to the Minister, so particularly in the Constabulary and the Prison Probation Service, they are vested with a number of particularly coercive powers, stop search, the power to detain people, the power to search their homes, the power to use force on people whilst in custody. So all of those things are reported to the department, and the department can dig into either specific issues or can see trends. And it is a work in progress, as the Minister said, but I think if you speak to the Chief Constable and ask him what he provides in terms of the data and information, it's equivalent to what he was providing to the Police and Crime Commissioner when he was in West Yorkshire, a force of 10,000 officers for an incredibly complex and diverse community. And I think, you know, the prison governor would probably also say the amount of information that he has to provide to the department on a quarterly basis is equivalent to that which he probably provided for a private prison operating in the UK.
Certainly I can elaborate on that, and certainly, you know, the checks and balances are in place to ensure that we are doing things that we say we are doing. And certainly, for example, I mean, the Chief Officer then talked about, for example, use of force. So we look at the trend, how many times has that happened in the quarter? Is there a particular group that has been targeted or whatever? Have there been any complaints as a result of that? So those checks and balances are there to ensure that we are doing what we say we're doing, and certainly it's transparent, and we are treating, you know, the people in our care, you know, appropriately.
And sorry, Minister.
No, well, one thing I was going to add is I know members of the Constitutional, Legal Affairs and Justice Committee heard from the Chief Constable a little earlier this month. So I think one of the things that we are cognizant of is there are still some challenges in capturing all of this data, because not all of it is as automated as we would like. I know in particular there was a question raised about when we profile the amount of stop search, we're also interested in the ethnicity, and some of that, you know, some of our ability to capture data and then have a meaningful exploration with either the Chief Constable or indeed the prison governor around what is happening is of course affected by how well data is input and captured, and then how well we're able to run reports. So I don't pretend that we have fully arrived at the perfect reporting, but from the point when I joined the department as the Minister to where we are now, things have moved on incredibly. There's a lot of work, it's really appreciated. And the other thing that we do is we track where we've had inspections and there are action plans. So for example, the Prison and Probation Service are running their action plan still, and the Fire and Rescue Service had a peer review, and the HMI, yes. So as part of that quarterly reporting, we also look at where is progress against the actions coming out of those peer reviews and inspections.
Just before I hand back to the Chair, just finish on this, because you mentioned a couple of things that we're going to move on, so I'm going to combine those two together now if I can. What performance indicators do you use to as a benchmark service outcomes against comparable jurisdictions? And also, talking of external inspections, can you provide an update on that, and have you been able to arrange an inspection of the probation service that was talked about?
If I can talk just around benchmarking, so we use the MOJ produce a huge amount of data on prisons in the United Kingdom. So for example, when we look at things like time out of cell, lots of information is provided by the Ministry of Justice, either based on HMIP reports or just on data they've gathered. So for example, we broadly know that in an equivalent sort of category B prison in the UK, like a training prison like Wakefield, which is actually far less complex than the prison which is operated here because of the different numbers of offenders and remand prisoners. They generally have a time out of cell of about 5 or 6 hours, as you'll see in the data we've provided to you. On a day without evening association, generally it's about 6.5 hours out of cell, but with an evening association added on, then that's probably about 8 hours 50 minutes. So that shows us we're comparing favourably to the UK. It's not sort of at the level which is recommended, which is more than 10 hours, but given the constraints on the service, we see that as a positive in the way. So we do look at a wide range of areas where we compare for a benchmarking position. But sometimes it's really, really hard to benchmark because of the unique nature of the service and how we operate the prison.
Certainly after 3 decades in the service across different sectors, this, is the most complex place I've worked. And, I worked in the private sector. I came from G4S, where we mobilised a prison of over 2,000 prisoners, which was a big mobilisation and to get prisoners into there. But having all these prisoners under one roof and being able to monitor that, whether that's sex offenders, females, remands, convicted and now lifers, it is a complex piece of work.
Chair, you...
Yes, I just wanted to just dial back a little bit. Minister, you mentioned first response. So, just to clarify that, do fire officers attend first response cardiac arrest?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So does that impact on the service, the fire service itself, or
No.
no?
I mean, my view, and I fully support the Chief Fire Officer in this. This came about, I think, I can't remember, it was 2023 or 2024, but there was a meeting of different heads of service, including the ambulance service, and there was, I think actually it was a call that came in, and there was a police officer on blues and sirens that went out as the only way of responding at that point. And the Chief Fire Officer said, this is not right. We have the capability in terms of the training of the Fire and Rescue Service and the kit on board the fire and rescue trucks. We have the capability to respond. Why aren't we responding if that's necessary at that point? And I think from that point on, working with the ambulance service, that has been part of the operating model. The ambulance service provide training, so there is joint training that goes on. And the other thing that's been a really positive thing coming out of it, I think, is the medical kit that was on the fire trucks unfortunately was going out of date because not all of the time are you going to need to use it, but the very fact that there is more responding and more joint working with the ambulance service means that the medical kit is being taken out and used before it goes out of date, but also it is being used in that sense. I think the other thing I would say, having gone out and visited all the fire stations, which we try and do each year, the retained stations as well as the Douglas whole time watches, they are reporting that they are keen to do this work because it uses their skill set and their training. There is no doubt, though, that it is a different type of demand for the fire and rescue service, so it's not affecting their ability to respond to what we might refer to as traditional fire and rescue responses. It is a different experience, though, for the fire and rescue service and staff, and that's why I think it's very important we keep an eye on this and make sure that all the support is there for members of the fire and rescue service if they are going to different types of emergency that might have a different impact for them.
Would that have been utilised? I think it was last Tuesday the ambulance service reported a record number of call-outs in a single day, if I recall correctly.
That's correct.
Over 80.
Yeah. There's no doubt that fire service first responders would have gone to a Category 1. It's basically an acute cardiac arrest situation. But just to speak to Mrs. Corlett's point around capacity, what has happened probably over the past 20 years that as building standards have increased, for example, things like structure fires have decreased significantly in both the survivability, but just also their frequency. Things like building regulations in housing and multiple occupations have changed, and the fire safety standards have improved. So there are fewer traditional fire service calls, and that leaves capacity in particularly amongst the retained service actually in the community. And as the Minister says, I think the retained service see this as an extra part of their service to the community, and it's really challenging. Lots of them. I was talking to a firefighter yesterday, and they said that they probably attend as a station more Category 1 alerts to a person who's undergoing a cardiac arrest than probably a lot of paramedics, because of the way the schedule works, but because they're on station, and generally the way that a retained station responds, the first 6 people to get to the station are the ones on the truck, so the people nearest the station are often the ones consistently going out. And so if there is an issue in a particular area where ambulances aren't often available as quickly as a fire appliance would be, or a fire crew, then you will see more firefighters responding to first response. But I think generally firefighters see it as a really important part of their role, and it reduces demand for Manx care.
Well, that quick response does make sense. I just wondered, do you monitor sort of how much you're supplementing the ambulance service in that? Is there clear
In pounds, we do.
delineation
We do,
between
and
who's doing what?
We do, and that's the benefit of this reporting, because we can now see not only the volume, but we attribute the cost to that, because obviously there's the retained fee that goes to the fire officer. The thing I would say, though, is this is a really good example of driving best value across all of our emergency services, because we have got, and we must have, a level of trained staff available to deal with emergencies. If we are seeing fewer Category 1 fires happening, we're not going to reduce the number of trained fire staff or equipment, because we have to have a certain level. Therefore, the ability to utilise that still in the interests of community safety and in a way that people practice and use relevant skills has to be a benefit and a value overall.
Yeah.
And finally, just to the point around response, we set targets for rural and urban responses for the fire service, both for retained and whole time, and they're reported to the department. So back to that kind of cycle of reporting, if we noticed a decline in response times, for example, then we'd ask the chief fire officer to look into that, and if it could be attributed to, for example, to more people attending Category 1 ambulance calls, then potentially we'd look at it. But at the moment, we don't see a decrease in response times.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hooper.
I was just going to ask about when you were talking about performance indicators and benchmarks in response to Mr. Glover's question. The example you gave was around the amount of time a prisoner would spend in a cell or on lock. I was actually interested to understand whether you measure outcomes rather than just widgets, essentially. I mean, that's quite an operational thing, measuring how long prisoners are in a cell, but surely the whole point of our prison and probation service is to stop people reoffending. That's one of the main aims. Do you measure those sort of service level outcomes as well?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We measure a range of outcomes. So if you think, it's probably a three-part approach. One is the performance of the activity, which I think is really important, because if we knew that prisoners were only getting 2 hours out of their cell, then that would be an issue. Or if we knew that people were being segregated for longer than is set out in the custody rules, then that would be an issue. We measure performance against the department's the department's plan, and then we measure performance against any island plan contributions and any outstanding reports or audits we've got. So I think that there are outcomes, and we do measure reoffending rates. That's on an 18-month basis, which matches back to the UK. Because it's basically a year with an extra 6 months to allow for any processing of court time. So we absolutely measure outcomes.
And is that information published anywhere?
It's published in our department plan to some extent.
So our KPIs, at the end of each year, the KPIs that are in the department plan, when we did our closing update for 24-25, it must have been, I think, the previous year, we did show the tracking. I mean, the detail we're not publishing all of the detail the department is getting. So, that's a quarterly report from the Prison and Probation Service. We are not publishing all of that, but we are using it ourselves internally to track that. And I think back to trends, sometimes we're looking at very small numbers. So I would say our ability to really measure the outcomes and not just the widgets is also to really get smarter at looking also at the inputs and how they're benefiting the outputs. So if I think about honourable members have all been invited to the opening of the Skills Centre, I think next or a week on Wednesday. That's doing amazing work. What would be really good is to then be able to say, right, if people are getting City and Guilds accredited training, when we track someone leaving the prison, what does that mean? Is that really adding to people's ability to get a job, stay in employment and so on? And that's the bit for me that I think I would like to see developed even further, because in the end, you're right, it is about outcomes as much as activity and how well things are operating day to day.
Value.
Some of this was covered as well in the report updates that were published. I think it was last August was the last one that was published around the independent inspection. You put an action plan, I think you called it, and it was an update. And I think Mr. Glover asked as well how things were progressing with those, because those action plans had a lot of things that were supposed to be done by December last year or January this year. Just curious as to where you're up to.
And also I did ask, you mentioned about an inspection of the probation services. So
Oh, yeah,
made
sorry.
progress on that.
So we haven't made progress on inspection of the probation service simply because there is no capacity within the department to handle. It's quite an intensive process in terms of being ready for the audit, but we absolutely do intend to do that. That is something that's on the list to do. I think we found that doing it properly has been a hugely intensive process, and the probation service has been through quite a period of flux and change and quite a lot of demand, but we absolutely do intend to do that. I'm happy to put that on record and say that we will hopefully get an inspection of the probation service, but we're due a re-inspection of the constabulary, we're due a re-inspection of the prison service as well, so we do want to work towards that.
And to your point, actually, you're right. We published in August 2025 an update of the action plan. Behind that, though, and I'm sure the camera can sort of pick this up, but behind that, on a quarterly basis, we've got a much more detailed analysis of what is happening to deliver those. So some of it is resource, as the Chief Officer has said, to actually generate published updates is quite resource intensive. So I imagine we will want to update this published action plan again at some point later this year. But I would say that the department, and it's a testament to the Prison and Probation Service, that they provide a level of detail back to the department for us to, one, understand what progress is being made, and a huge amount of progress has been made. But where there are challenges in doing that, that then at least allows us to have a discussion about, well, is there anything else that can be done to support progress in that area? Or do we have to acknowledge that with all the work that's going on, some things have slowed down for a bit, and what is the consequence? Can we tolerate if something has slowed down, if there's a good reason for that? So there is a lot of detailed reporting going on behind what is published.
I think that was the substance of Mr. Glover's question, because when you look through that last update, nearly everything in there was due to be completed by the end of last year. So there are only a couple of actions in there that are January 26, but as far as I can tell, nearly everything in there, apart from one or two that are dated 2028, and they're normally around the Manx Care data records and things, everything in that action plan was set to be completed by now.
So I think.
So the question is there anything in there that you said you were going to complete by now that hasn't been completed? I think that's where Mr. Glover was going with this question.
I think some of the policy areas remain a work in progress, just because there are a lot of them, and they are being worked through again on a prioritised basis.
I mean, we had the HMIP team come back. I mean, the process normally is they come on an unannounced inspection and then they come back and see progress. And certainly the lead, Charlie Taylor of the HMIP, came back and he was satisfied that we had made progress in terms of the short space of time we had done on. We weren't there yet, but he could see there was work in progress and continue. The normal rule of thumb is then they'll have an unannounced, where they won't tell you they're coming and they'll just turn up. Just on the point of probation being inspected, as part of HMIP, there are 5 expectations. One of those is preparation for release, and there's key points in there that fall under the probation umbrella. So during their time of the inspection, certainly probation was not overlooked, and they feed into a lot of things that happen within the prison setting as well. For example, children and families, reducing reoffending, public protection, interventions and support, and returning to the community. So those would have been key areas. And I do remember there were some key public protection bits for the probation itself, which that's work in progress. We've addressed some, but that work continues.
Yeah, just on the policy, sorry, we put a September 2026 completion date. I know that is one of the hardest bits of work to do, because there are many policies that need to be reviewed and updated. So we're monitoring that. I think the other area is, I mentioned the Skills Centre, which is doing brilliant work. We're still in the course of determining the revised whole model for education, because we recognise we would like to do more. We also understand that with a larger prison population, we want to make sure we've got the capacity overall to be able to do as much as we can around the education and training space. So we're conscious that that's work that's still ongoing and that we're monitoring.
Just going to move on. Since we last met, the Domestic Abuse Multi-Agency Action Plan has been published, and you mentioned that you would continue to deliver training for people to be more alert to signs of domestic abuse. Can I ask who has been the target audience for that training, and how many people have completed it, and again, how are you measuring outcomes from that training?
So there's been a variety of training. A lot of it is to do with the people who are involved professionally in either investigating or supporting and handling situations that have involved domestic abuse. So, for example, the constabulary have had specialist training in the application of the DARA, which is the Domestic Abuse Risk Assessment, which is very specifically to support identification of coercive control. So they have had that training, and that is now being deployed as part of their risk assessment alongside the DASH, which was previously in place. There has been, well, I don't know if it's actually happened, but I know it was planned. We can check and update you. Planned to do some training specifically for prosecution, which was also about understanding vulnerabilities and risk, understanding people with neurodivergence. So that training was available. We spoke to the Law Society. I think that was 18 months. That was at least 18 months, 2 years ago, in order to encourage them to do some training for legal professionals around identification of things like, or awareness around elder abuse and financial abuse. There was the Domestic Abuse Conference, which was targeted more broadly, which was a great success, and I think we're planning another conference this summer.
Right, June this year.
So in other words, there are different types of training. There's some specialist training. I can't comment off the top of my head on training that's offered in health and social care, but we may be able to get some information for you on that. But it's quite bespoke in some ways, and important to be targeted to the nature of the professional who is engaging. And I think the other thing that we've tried to do that we've had some positive feedback around is the campaign that started before Christmas to raise awareness more broadly about coercion and control, financial abuse and elder abuse in the public mind more generally. And then, as I say, there's more specialist training that operates. I don't have any figures for you about actual numbers that have gone through the training, but we may be able to. We may be able to.
Well, can I just go to one of the actions in the plan, and a quote from it: ensure that you can develop innovative and timely responses to support child and adult victims of domestic abuse and proactively manage offenders. So maybe give us a little bit more detail on how that is being done.
Sure. So there have been a number of initiatives. We have partnered with a charitable organisation to support the delivery of what's called Own My Life, which is a programme for women who are victims of domestic abuse, to help them take back control of their own life, and to support them in breaking free from their perpetrator and the offending behaviours, and to rebuild their own confidence. So we've worked with a third party to provide that training. We actually funded it as a pilot last year, supported it, and that will go forward. That's a 3-year programme, and that's in partnership with Victim Support and the provider of this programme. So that's specifically focused on female victims of domestic abuse and coercive control. Obviously, we operate the Operation Encompass form of Operation Encompass. So if a child is in a household where there has been a domestic incident, then the constabulary will tell the teacher the next day, and that helps the teacher deal with any behavioural issues that the child has maybe delivering. We have obviously there was a closure of the refuge, and colleagues in the Domestic Abuse Forum have worked really closely with constabulary, with housing associations, and a temporary pathway to ensure that there are pathways in place, particularly for female victims and survivors of domestic abuse with their child, to ensure that they've got proper accommodation. The Domestic Abuse Forum has run a series of workshops over a period of the last year to support kind of practitioners in delivering effective services on to to people who are victims and survivors of domestic abuse. And we're looking at the Power to Change campaign, which is a behavioural change campaign looking potentially at perpetrators as well, because that's another important area. But also we had an app, which was the Bright Sky app on a phone, which is an app that basically survivors and victims of domestic abuse can install on their phone, and it allows them to get access to certain services. At the minute it's quite limited in the Isle of Man because there is only one registered provider, which is Victim Support, and of course the department does fund Victim Support and works really, really closely. I can't underscore the importance of the working relationship we've got with Victim Support, and particularly their Chief Executive, Lorna Trevethan, who is a really active participant in the Domestic Abuse Forum. She's she holds the department to account, challenges the department in a really constructive way, but it's a really, really effective partnership we've got, and the numbers of people supported and referred into Victim Support for domestic abuse continues to increase year on year, but they are a really effective partner.
Just something the committee may also be interested in on the partnering with Victim Support. The other thing that's very helpful, and back to outcomes, is triangulating the reporting, for example, the department get about the numbers of cases that go forward to prosecution when they're domestic abuse or sexual offences or rape. And Lorna and Victim Support are doing a piece of work to try and help triangulate whether there are factors around why victims may not support a prosecution, and to understand whether the degree to which they become involved and are able to support is able to make a difference or not. So that partnership work is very helpful, not only because it drives the sort of training and intervention that the Chief Officer has referenced, but also because it helps us understand what are the things that can and do make a difference to supporting things like a successful prosecution or a victim being able to go through the justice process.
Okay. Mrs. August-Pitt.
Thank you. I was just wondering, it's been a while since I've been in the Department for Home Affairs as a member. It's a good 4.5 years ago now. So the service level agreement that sits between the department and Victim Support, how much now goes to Victim Support? I don't know if you're allowed to or that's something that you can share. And also, what do you get for that? Like what service level do you get for that? What kind of training do the individuals over at Victim Support actually have? And what do you get?
Okay, that's a fair question. We give £80,000 a year to Victim Support, and that has to cover a range of services. So it does cover services for victims, so to help people navigate the court process, whether they're a victim of any form of crime. They also, as part of our funding, we use that part of that funding to allow Victim Support to help victims apply for the compensation scheme, which is important part of redress and helping victims kind of get back on the road to recovery. So we primarily what we get from our funding really is the service that Victim Support provides for victims of sexual and violent crime. And we only provide a small proportion of where it's £80,000, but it's down to Victim Support to provide training. That's on them. We give them the grant and we specify that we want them to undertake these three main areas of service, but it's up to them how they deliver it and the kind of training that they provide. But we're also just working. Sorry, Mr. Hooper, you kind of pulled a bit of a face there, like you didn't agree with that.
I was just a bit sorry. You mentioned it was a grant. I would have thought that in this context, where you're having somebody provide such a vital service for the department, it would be a contractual relationship whereby you commission a service saying, "This is what I expect. This is the level of standard, and here's the money for it."
And we do have that. We do have that as part of the contract, but it's more of it's a sort of hybrid grant / commission service. It's difficult to call it a commission service because they do certain things as Victim Support, which we give them part funding for, but they also use some of their charitable funding for. So it's a slightly difficult situation. It was never contracted in the past at all. There were never any performance indicators around it. So we have worked over a period of time to try and professionalise that. We get really, really comprehensive statistics from Victim Support each quarter, and we meet with Victim Support on a quarterly basis to review their performance and share any issues, both on an operational nature, in terms of their engagement with the constabulary, for example, and other agencies in government, but also the performance of the contract. So it's a bit of a hybrid, really, that we're not just saying here's £80,000, go and do amazing things. We are writing a contract with specifications, but some of it, because they get the majority of their funding from other sources, it's difficult to sort of say you must only do this because we only provide a small proportion of it.
Sorry, I think my concern was more the other way around. From what I've experienced from the healthcare side of things, is quite often there will be a level of commission service that is actually subsidised by the charitable support that is obtained. And then when you have issues with that, you run into a problem where an organisation may be relied on by the state to provide a core service, but that's actually being charitably funded as opposed to funded by the state itself, which sometimes puts organisations in a difficult position then when they're being told by the state, well, I'm paying you to do X, and the organisation will be saying, that's great, but we're actually providing a service well above and beyond what you're funding, and we're funding that through our other means of funding, not through the £80,000 contract. And so we have issues with that funding stream. Your service is at risk. That was kind of what I was
kind of where I was going to go as well. So.
And I think you're absolutely right from the health, but there are historic arrangements, I would say, where it has been more or less a grant, perhaps without things being agreed and clarified appropriately, and I think that is an important part of the work that has been going on. So there is more clarity about what actually is a minimum service level, or what do we need. I think as we're doing work as well, we understand that there may be more things that it's helpful for a specialist service to provide to victims going through the criminal justice process, because it is difficult for example, police officers, much as they want to do the right thing and keep in touch with the witness. They're working shift systems, they've got they've got all manner of things that they're trying to juggle. It might not be as easy for them to act as well as they would like to as a support for a victim. So we're very conscious, I think, of the value and the great contribution that victim support provide, but to your point about, well, what is it we need and how do we make sure those things are sustainable? You're right, it's an ongoing piece of work, I think.
Yeah.
And we do have a separate contract for a victim liaison service, which is basically victim support telling victims exactly what is going to happen. So if their perpetrator is going to be released, they won't give them the exact date, but they will say your perpetrator is due to be released, these are the conditions, is there anything you want to add? And so that's a really important service, but that's a commission service, and that's specifically surrounded by a contract with a set of key performance indicators. And as the Minister said, we're also looking to work with a witness management service which will replace the work the police currently do, which is very good, but it is not always reliable, as the Minister said, because of shift work. And that, again, be a specific contracted commission service.
Yeah. And I do have to be fair to you, because I do recall that when you first started over at DHA, that was one of the first things that you then dealt with, was the contract between the two.
And it was a really challenging discussion for an organisation that hadn't previously had to have that level of discussion and engagement. So thank you.
So, can I ask, at the government conference last year, you said that discussions were ongoing about the introduction of ID checks
Yes.
at Manx ports. So, has any further progress been made on that?
Yes, so round about the government conference we were in, we had some productive discussions with the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, and we've had further productive discussions since. And I think we can say that we are shortly due to put out a consultation around people carrying ID with them when they are travelling to and from the island. This is very much from the angle that we talked about at the government conference, which is security and criminality. So we want to put out a consultation. The Steam Packet have been very engaged with the department. We understand they have how we implement this is important to the Steam Packet, you know, particularly at peak travel times, for example, around the TT and so on. You know, they have their operational needs to manage and think about. So we are working very closely with them, but they're very productive discussions. And as I say, we want to put out a consultation with some proposals around how we make the change so that people carry ID. I think the other thing it's probably worth saying, because I know I know Mrs. August Phillips has always been interested in the information sharing and that angle to all of this, but actually when it's part of carrier terms and conditions, then it's absolutely appropriate. So
And are the same discussions going on with the airport?
The airport's a slightly more patchwork approach at the moment. So the terms and conditions of carriers are generally different. So, for example, EasyJet only requires you to present ID if you have checked baggage, but not for all domestic flights. For British Airways, for example, you're required to present ID. I think when we look at threat, harm and risk, we see the greatest threat at the moment through the ports. The airport are important, and we know that the airports are exploited from time to time, but we think that focusing on the steam packet first and then moving to aircraft carriers, but also we know that, for example, in Ireland now, because of the ETA changes, that you will be required to present ID to travel from Dublin to the Isle of Man on all aircraft. So I think when we look at what we've got the most effective control over and where we see the greatest area of risk, that's why we've started with the steam packet.
I think the other thing that Manx passengers or passengers travelling from the Isle of Man have experienced in recent times is actually there's been some immigration border force control in the UK. Now that's completely out with our control, but they have taken some measures to ask for ID even on CTA flights. So I think the general direction of travel is that the idea that people will need to carry some sort of identification is probably with us. The question is, what's the appropriate way for us to manage the carrying of ID? And as part of the consultation, you know, we recognise, for example, that some people may, for good reason, not have photographic identification. So what are the alternates that we will say are going to be valid, and how we're going to manage? There's the carrying of ID, and then there's the how we may go about actually checking any of that.
Thank you. And do you expect to deliver the regulation of surveillance amendment bill to enable the introduction of facial recognition before the end of this administration, or is that something that's going to carry over?
It's going to carry over. The reason for that is it needs to be consulted upon. It's too important a subject not to go through a proper consultation, and we do not. The time, you know, that would be a 6-week consultation in my view, in line with best practice consultation. Where we are now, we haven't begun that consultation. So, with the best will in the world, I have learnt, despite my high ambition and dreams to move everything through in a positive way, 6 weeks consultation and processing the output of that, and then determining how you make any changes that you may need to make before you actually present a bill to the branches. Unfortunately, we don't have time. However, we are going to continue with this because it is important. So that's something I would say about all of our legislation, where we do not manage to get a bill now into the branches that will have a chance of coming through before the dissolution of the Keys. It doesn't mean it's not important. I am very keen that we still get the drafting work done and we get these bills out for consultation, if need be, over the summer, so that a new administration has the opportunity to pick up some legislation that's got to the best point we can and hopefully move it forward.
Thank you.
Is ANPR part of that same?
We've already got a legislative basis for NPR through the Road Traffic Regulation Act, I think, or the
Yes, so we passed the relevant suite of secondary legislation to facilitate the use of ANPR at the ports.
And that's in place.
That's in place.
Operational.
I've always been a bit of an advocate of ministers looking at a more of a 10-year programme for legislation as opposed to a 5-year programme for legislation, because of the resource that we've got in both policy and legislative, and with legislative drafters. But my question is more around the photographic ID checks. You talked about having alternatives. Is there anything across our statute? If we had a look across statute to see if there's anything, there are examples of alternates that you know people might use if they don't have photographic ID at the ports. Is there other examples of that, or alternatively, if there isn't anything on our statute books, then perhaps other jurisdictions?
There are lots of examples where, so for example, if you visit a prison in the UK and you don't have photographic ID, there's a specific set of criteria you can meet. You might be able to bring a bank statement and a utility bill and a debit card issued in your name. So I think that's part of the consultation, but there's nothing in statute at the moment that applies to that and that we have. But in any event, what we would be looking to do is to be putting the requirement to carry ID in conditions of travel. So the steam packet would put that in their conditions of travel, which is the way that the airlines do it at the moment. Yeah. So it's part of their terms and conditions of travel. Yeah. And we'd set out what the alternate forms of ID were if people were not able to bring photographic ID to verify against the passenger name.
But you've had a look at other jurisdictions, though.
Yes, we have. Yeah.
Yeah. And what kinds of things might we?
Well, like I said, I think that it varies from the way that the prison service set out a hierarchy of documents, which we think is quite good. So we'll go out to consultation and we will look at what the alternates are. But we've looked across a couple of different places.
Mr. Hooper.
It's interesting you say you're going to place some of this in conditions of travel, because obviously the steam packet is the main ferry service to and from the island, but actually we have a number of ports where people can get onto the island under other means, private boats, for example. It's surprising that you're not looking at a route that would actually cover all the ports of entry, but instead focusing just on the conditions of carriage for the steam packet.
Well, I think the interesting thing though is people don't generally book to, if people are using, it's a bit like the private jet centre down at the airport. There are things we can do around intelligence and understanding who is travelling in other ways. But I think the thinking is when people are booking and travelling, one of the challenges has been that you can book under any name, and there's no means at the moment of verifying actually who is travelling, which becomes very important when you're trying to take quite an intelligence-led approach to your monitoring of the ports. So I think that's the rationale, but it's not to say that in the Securing Our Island strategy, absolutely it's recognised that there are other ways for people to travel to and from the Isle of Man, and that they are part of that. Again, it's about prioritising where we put our efforts, I think.
You mentioned about manifests as well, so I'd assume that as part of this plan, the steam packet will be sharing its manifest information.
We probably don't want to talk too much in public about the approach by which the constabulary gather information.
Okay. This will happen relatively soon, this requirement around ID coming in, do you think? You mentioned that facial recognition, all the rest of it will be much later, but in terms of implementing new requirements around ID at the ports, that will be consulted on soon and possibly introduced.
We're going to consult in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. Well, subject to department approval, we'll go to consultation, and that'll be a 6-week consultation, I imagine, and we hope to have something in place subject to the operational exigencies of the steam packet company. I think it should be something that's relatively easy to implement.
And I'm assuming that you've engaged heavily with the steam packet company on this, because obviously you can't force them to change their conditions of carriage. That's a decision they'll have to make themselves.
And that's when I said at the beginning we've had productive discussions. We absolutely have. I think the difference is where we need a legislative underpinning, that is the stuff that takes longer. Whereas if we have a means to make a change after we've done some consultation that can be done via conditions of carriage, then we can do that by agreement.
Thank you. The regulation of surveillance amendment bill, I'm assuming that would probably, sort of like the GDPR, would that kind of need updating in order to be able to bring that in regarding biometrics, or is that something that would be covered within the legislation, or does it not need to be covered within the legislation?
I think the point of putting facial recognition into primary legislation is to clarify exactly the legal basis on which you can collect that biometric information, which is special category data under the GDPR and the LED, the Law Enforcement Directive. In the UK at the moment, they rely on a framework of different legislation. There is nothing in primary legislation, and you might have seen there have been 2 judgments in relation to South Wales Police, I think, and the use of facial recognition, but they rely on common law and other legal bases as a patchwork of information. But what we wanted to do was put this on a primary basis, which then addresses the issues around the legality of it under the GDPR and the Law Enforcement Directive.
Okay, thank you.
So we're just going to move to emergency service now. So feasibility studies for the blue light hubs are due to be completed in March this year. So according to your department plan. So is that on track for completion?
Well, we have got reports, I believe.
Sorry,
This is the feasibility studies for the blue light hub. So we have had a lot of work happened, I would say, autumn time, working with all the service areas, and the reports have been prepared. They have not yet come through the department, but the Chief Officer can elaborate.
We've done a huge amount of work in the past 3 months with all of the service heads, and we finally got to a position where we have reports for all of the emergency services in the Department of Home Affairs and Manx Care, and we are now pulling together basically a sort of 10-year document which will set out a plan for all of the replacement of all the emergency services buildings in the Isle of Man. And by the way, they are all very out of date, incredibly difficult operationally for a 21st century emergency services. So we think that this is the best bit of information the best series of information we've had in a long time around the approach. We think at the minute, and the Minister's not seen that, so I don't want to, but we don't think that there is going to be an enormous single hub that occupies 5,000 square hectares in central Douglas. We think it's probably more likely to be a series of individual replacements, but with the opportunity for shared facilities where appropriate. But it's been a really, really engaging process, and we have got all the feasibility reports, and we will bring them to the department hopefully in the next couple of weeks for then onward transmission and engagement with Treasury and other colleagues.
And I think the point about the 10-year plan or a phased plan is very, very important, because we've heard about the challenges with capital funding. And so what I would really like to see is, you know, by the time we get to the end of the administration, that we have got something that can move forward and that people can try and get behind, because then the planning, the project development and all of that good work can be progressed.
Do you intend to report to Tim Wold on any of your plans?
Yeah, I think once we get the 10-year strategy and we get that agreed with Treasury colleagues and ensure that everybody's on board with it, we'll absolutely bring that strategy to Tim Wold.
Okay.
It's not cheap.
I'm sure it is.
Do you mind if I ask on that actually? So in the 2024 budget, there was £145,000 allocated. That was rolled over to 2025. I think it's been rolled over again into 2026. I'm assuming that that's the funding that will be utilised for
exactly
for
so.
for the feasibility work.
Mm-hmm.
It is a little bit concerning because obviously it's a 10-year plan. We know that the Treasury Minister has said there's only a £50 million per year capital budget in his plan at least, but that will basically be completely exhausted by things like Castle Rushen, and the Blue Light strategy could exhaust your entire capital programme if we're not careful. Has that been considered in conversations with Treasury, and when they were planning their £50 million a year, they were aware of all this stuff coming down the road, I would imagine?
To be fair, the timing of the budget versus the timing of getting, because I haven't seen this plan yet. I've had some discussions, which is why I understand that it's not likely, the idea of the single hub that will work for all the services is not realistic from all the feasibility work that now has happened. But this work is now coming along afterwards. But I think more broadly, in terms of our overall capital programme and how we phase the work that needs to happen across the blue light services with the work that needs to happen across schools and other infrastructure, is going to be a critical discussion, because there will have to be some decisions made about prioritisation.
Just thinking back to when I say in my constituency, we've got an ambulance station that needs reinvestment, a fire station that needs reinvestment, and that's just in Ramsey.
Same in Teal.
Everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. The North and West are part of our 10-year strategy for blue light, and we think there's probably more opportunity to share in the regions than there is in the centre, just because of the way the services operate.
But that's what's good about this work, is it has picked up the region. I mean, the only place that it didn't need to pick up really is the south, because it's got the most modern facilities, but it is, a plan, I hope, that will cover the island. The other thing that has been going on that I think is really helpful through the engagement of all the heads of services, we talked about fire and rescue and the nature of their work and so on. I mean, all that knowledge and data, the community risk management plan, that's the sort of thing that's also been sitting there as a helpful source of data and information that while you're devising your replacement of actual facilities and buildings, you're working with meaningful data rather than giving it your best guess.
I think that's probably important just to say that the response time is absolutely vital, and it's been a really helpful piece of work that the person who's working with us on the feasibility has been able to say, well, what about this site? And the Chief Fire Officer can map exactly what the detriment or improvement in response times will be from certain areas, and it's been really, really helpful, because when you've got specific response times for ambulance and specific response times for fire service, they don't exist in the same sphere because they've got different overlaps of response time in their circle, and the radius is radii within which they operate. But also the challenge is that the way that the fire and rescue service works, once you're in Douglas, once your primary whole-time crew goes out, you then have to then bring a whole-time crew into backfill, and you have to take their travel time into account. So there are all of these considerations, and it's been a really complex bit of work.
And that's also taken into account what you were saying, sort of around, you know, the each individual fire station. Say, for example, I seem to remember like going out there and looking across each one of those stations, and this was a long time ago now, so it probably will have changed an awful lot during that period of time. But there were a number of fire stations, say for example, that had a lot of asbestos in the ceiling, which made it very difficult to change the lights. So the working environment of the individuals that are working in our emergency services are expected to be improved then.
Yeah, absolutely. And even things like for female firefighters, it's really hard to have mixed facilities for female firefighters, particularly in Douglas, for example. So, and that limits the number of female firefighters you can have on a crew at any one time. But all of these things need modernising, and they don't reflect. Even so, Douglas Fire Station, again, the doors of the fire station don't reflect the bigger height of the new appliances, and you know, we had to work to open one of the bays of one of the doors to accommodate the new fire appliance. So it's they're just no longer fit for purpose, and it's been a long time coming, and it's long overdue. But hopefully, we should get some traction.
So staying with fire services, when will the fire services and the fire safety bills be introduced into the branches?
So again, there's been an awful lot of work progressed around this. You will have seen that the principals went out for consultation. What has happened is you've seen the extent of the Department of Home Affairs legislative programme. That combined with other work has led to something of a bottleneck in drafting. I know they're all working at absolutely full capacity. So the fire services and fire safety bill, they will not now make it through before the end of this administration. But in the same way I said before that it matters that these bills are progressed, they are drafted, and they go out for consultation, the same applies there. So the aim the department has at the moment, and this is also true for the police amendment bill, which we also need to bring forward, because that supports some other changes, including our updating of conduct and complaints matters. So the aim is to have them all drafted and for them to be able to go out to consultation, if need be, over the summer. But again, to try and get to a position where a new administration is able to say, oh, look, there's some legislation here that's pretty much ready to go, and start moving things in the branches quite early. That's certainly what we're working towards.
Are there any high risks in relying on outdated legislation?
I think the legislation, we've worked with the legislation for as long as we have, and there aren't really significant risks. It's more about moving to more contemporary standards than particularly mitigating operational risks.
Do you mind if I just ask you, that's the second time you've mentioned about doing some extensive consultation work over the summer period. Do you really think that's a sensible approach, given that you're at the tail end of one administration, you'll be moving into the next? It's unlikely, I would suggest in the extreme, that people who are running for election for the first time or who are seeking re-election are going to have time and capacity to engage in a consultative process, especially around stuff that's very critical, the things you talked about, facial recognition, fire service reform. And the risk you run there, of course, is you've done your consultation, you present it to a new administration which is full of newly elected politicians who turn around and say, well, I've not seen any of this. You have to start the whole process again. Do you not think that consulting over the summer period during an election period is probably not the most sensible thing to do with critical pieces of legislation like you're talking about?
Well, we have members of Legislative Council very much still available, and my experience is that not many Tynwald members respond to those consultations as a rule. What we're trying to do is get the public at large, any interested stakeholders. I mean, the fire legislation in and of itself is actually quite, I was going to say specialist, but you know, I would be loath to slow that. It's so important that I think Tynwald members, whoever is elected in September, will have ample time to look at what comes out of a consultation, to pick apart draft and to say, well, you haven't taken account of that, or whatever it may be. I agree with you, it's very important that whoever is here in the Keys and in Legislative Council and has to steer through important legislation, they really do need to understand it and they need to have an opportunity to input. But I think my own view is I wouldn't lose traction by not allowing the public and relevant stakeholders to still look at this legislation over the summer. It's my view, but I'm happy for everyone to tell me that's not the way we should go and stop everything in July.
I agree with you, actually.
Just going to move to drug exploitation. How is the action plan for the policy principles to inform the Isle of Man's approach to tackling harm caused by drugs progressing?
So I think there's been really good progress. We've got a multi-agency working group, and we have a document which we are going to bring to the Health, Learning and Social Policy Board, and then that will ultimately go to Tynwald, and that covers all aspects of drug harm from, as you said, things like exploitation, but more broadly in terms of education, school engagement. So that work is underway and is pretty much concluded. We've got a final draft of that document.
I haven't seen that yet, so I know you were at the Community Safety Partnership.
Yes. Today.
So that work has, we were trying to get that done by the end of December. It hasn't happened by the end of December, but definitely I'm pleased that there is now a final draft of that. Obviously, we will want to see it. It should go through the Health, Learning and Social Policy Board because it's multi-agency. Again, it's important that it has that sense check. But I'm really hoping that we will get to a point where that action plan can be surfaced in the public domain. It will, as I understand it anyway, from a couple of conversations I've had, it will capture what we already do and what is in place already, and capture some of the things that we want to try and do in order to better support the reduction of harms.
Have any early intervention programs been considered to reduce vulnerability to gang recruitment in particular, and also to prevent adverse childhood experiences?
So there is already the daily exploitation meeting, which is an operational meeting held between Constabulary and children's social work, which take all referrals into it from various agencies around young people who are at risk or at the edge of exploitation. So that work is ongoing. We've just concluded the Youth Justice Target Operating Model, and we're looking at an opportunity to co-locate police officers with social workers and potentially education officers as well. We're just exploring that at the moment, but I think that's really, really positive. So the other thing, obviously, is that the Interpretation Act made Statute Law Revision Bill? I can't remember now. It's so long ago. Statute Law Revision made an amendment to the Justice Reform Act, which gave the youth conditional cautions the ability to be brought into force, and youth conditional cautions will be we hope, a powerful tool for police officers to try and intervene early and support young people. Sorry,
I
Minister.
was going to say to your point about early intervention. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of points at which an intervention could come, and obviously I think everybody knows that the earlier you can intervene, the better. So there is some work going on which is not Home Affairs specific, but we're aware of the work around family hubs and public health work to try and support families better, which I think is absolutely at the very early point when you try and support families and you minimise the risk of adverse childhood experiences, but how that can play out. And the other piece of work that the Safeguarding Board is engaged in and leading on is a piece of work called Risks Outside the Home, which is very much about understanding. So we have the multi-agency safeguarding hub, where referrals come in when children and young people may be at risk. That broader risks outside the home work is very important, I think, and you specifically mentioned gang recruitment and other types of exploitation. One of the things that I know officers are very aware of now, is that we have a number of work streams running. And so one of the important things that we've managed to secure is some programme management resource, because again, there's a slight danger that there's merit in all of these things, but if they all run down their track instead of meshing and making sure that the Youth Justice Target Operating Model understands the thinking around risks outside the home, and that the MASH interweaves, then we're at risk of missing opportunities. So that programme management approach is about integration of all sensible work streams. It's also about prioritisation, that again, we just cannot deliver everything at once. And so there does have to be some thinking about building up and then making sure that we see that the things that we are putting in place back to outcomes, are they actually making a difference?
Can I just ask then, does the department review the multi-agency response to organised crime activity, and also do you assess the current policing resources are adequate for tackling organised drug exploitation, which the Chief Constable quite openly talks about organised crime in that area now?
Yeah, so I think the Chief, from a policy perspective, obviously we set the policing plan, the department sets the policing plan, and within that, yes, tackling serious and organised crime is an important part of it, but also community safety is an important part of it. And when I said there's a spectrum, there's what we want to see is intervention as early as possible, as appropriate for the police, in order to, which I think will also support the intervention work with serious and organised crime. The issue for the constabulary is they are going to have to respond to their statutory responsibilities in the first place, and they will also be guided by areas of serious threat, harm and risk. And where those areas are on the increase or there is statutory demand, that's what's going to put some pressure on some of the more interventionist, proactive, non-statutory requirement. There is some good work going on, I think, with school liaison officers, but I know that we in the department are very keen to make sure neighbourhood policing is where it needs to be, because I think that is a good opportunity for prevention, and keen to see things like the police early action team working well with youth justice and so on, because those are all really good opportunities to intervene and prevent, and also maybe to divert. And in terms of resourcing, we know we were really pleased that in the budget we have got specific funding, particularly for the Protecting Vulnerable Persons investigations team, because that's an area of increased demand. And again, we can see that by the complaints that are coming through and the numbers of investigations. And it's not just numbers, it's complexity. So I think the other thing is, when we're looking at the reporting, getting behind the actual numbers to understand the nature of the criminality and the complexity of investigating. But we also know that where there is higher demand and people need to be recruited into those roles, how do we make sure that we keep the pipeline of recruits coming in, cognizant as well of the profile of the workforce and the likely retirements over the coming 3 to 5 years?
2028.
Well, that's what the age profile of the constabulary tells us. And we will continue to work. We've been working really hard with the constabulary around all of this, and we will continue to do so because, it really matters.
Chair?
Could we move on to financial exploitation now? And does the department monitor cases of financial exploitation?
We monitor it as much as it's reported to the chief as part of the chief constable's quarterly reporting, and he obviously reports in the annual report as well. Obviously, the economic crime unit of the constabulary deals with these cases, and they have quite a large caseload at the moment, particularly relating to financial abuse of all sorts, so online abuse, but also financial exploitation. But as the Minister said earlier on, I think we've done quite a lot of work around awareness raising for financial exploitation. I think the challenge is trying to balance resource across all of these different competing demands. And, you have a really small police force which is trying to deal with financial abuse, coercive control, domestic abuse, sexual violence, and there are only a limited number of officers. And so the constabulary and the department try their best to prioritise and support work to address this harm, but we do keep oversight of financial abuse.
I think what's interesting is where the type of abuse cuts across maybe how operationally the constabulary is configured. So I talked before about the protecting vulnerable persons area of the police that has a safeguarding element and an investigations team. It is possible that there could be criminality that involves coercive control, and there might be financial abuse. So we've got an economic crime unit that's focused on domestic financial crime, which would pick up financial abuse, but it might also come in through the Protecting Vulnerable Persons Investigation Unit. Looking more broadly at financial money laundering and so on, that is sitting with our proactive international money laundering investigations team, particularly with the international focus. So I think it's about, have we got the right resource? Are we able to deal with it? But where perhaps there's a criminality that cuts across more than one sector, they are able to work together.
Okay, you won't have information today about how many cases have occurred over the past year, but is it possible to send us some figures on this?
We can do that.
That would be good. So I think around Christmas you linked up with victim support to do an awareness thing about domestic and elder abuse, and that included financial exploitation. So do you think that was a successful campaign? I realise it's hard to measure, but...
It is hard to measure. I mean, funnily enough, one of the adverts that I listened to, I think is quite impactful, because I think one of the messages they're trying to get across is the scamming, the trust, the abuse in that sense, that people build a relationship with someone online, they trust them, and then they try and take advantage of that. And so I think... Whether it's working, I'm sure people sitting around the table may have even come across constituents who've been affected in this way. And I think one of the most difficult things that I've come across is not only is it people lose out financially, but then they are quite often devastated that it's happened to them, and it's a difficult thing then to raise, to report, and to let people know what's happened to you. So I find it quite difficult to know how successful it's been, but for sure I think raising awareness that this is what does happen, and probably anything we can do to try and unpack any stigma and embarrassment that somebody may feel if they have been a victim of this type of crime, I think that would help people to report and then for these things to be investigated. But there are all sorts of very unfortunate situations where people end up sending packages of money off the island to someone that they think is help, and because they've formed a relationship online. It's quite a difficult thing to unpack and to destigmatise for people, I think.
Do you think that the financial services people do enough to try and help people to avoid these scams? I ask because I'm fairly savvy about these things, but somebody must have cloned one of my debit cards a couple of years ago, and all sorts of charges started to appear on the thing. So I tried to phone my bank to see whether or not this was kosher or not. Couldn't find a contact detail anywhere on the website, you know, and I suspect that that's similar for an awful lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so far as I know, the campaigns that have been going on are done in conjunction with Cyber Security Isle of Man, the Constabulary, and I think the Bankers Association. I think, you know, people are engaged. Whether or not individual banks could do some more to highlight risks and so on. I think that sort of cloning situation you talk about is very difficult. I think what's even more complex is where people form an emotional attachment to someone they've never met and then are scammed out of significant sums of money. So
I think most banking apps now have a range of warnings that say, when you try and make a payment, do you know this person, what's it for? And I think the banks do take it seriously and they do work closely, but some of these, as the Minister says, some of these scams are really, really sophisticated. And if you add AI into the mix now, AI emails, you know, often I think in the past you could tell by some of the grammar and English that they weren't necessarily actually, you know, Uncle Dave, but now, you know, they are massively sophisticated, and you know, their aim, the more effective they are, the more money they can get, and it is particularly challenging. But I do think there is good partnership and cooperation between the Isle of Man banks, between the Office of Cyber Security and Information Assurance, the victim support, and the constabulary.
And is there any intention to run any more awareness campaigns like the one we had at Christmas?
Yeah, I think we definitely want to run more campaigns to raise awareness amongst people. I think the challenge is time, and there are other issues that we need to raise awareness about. But I think, back to your point around effectiveness, you know, if you're selling toothpaste as an advert, you can probably gauge how many people have bought your toothpaste, but that impact, particularly where if somebody reports a crime and it might take 3 to 6 months to filter through the system, it's hard to kind of say whether or not the impact had the advert had an impact. But one of the things we might look at is things like awareness. So you know, are you more aware now of scams, and ask those kind of questions maybe in the social attitude survey to try and get a baseline.
And is there any training provided within the services in relation to identifying exploitation or coercion?
I think that probably goes back to what we were talking about earlier on around the vast array of training. So, for example, the DARA that the Constabulary are now using is very much focused on identifying coercive control, as opposed to what people may have thought of as the more you know, how people may have characterised domestic abuse. So to understand that coercive control, emotional abuse, financial abuse, these are all hallmarks of domestic abuse, and you know, the ways in which people can be exploited. And then I mentioned prosecutions going through some tailored training and so on. So I think there is a lot of work going on to try and raise awareness. One of the things that we were very keen with the Law Society was that as a legal practitioner, you may be the person when somebody is brought in to change their will or to undertake some other legal transaction. What signs can you look out for? What questions can you ask over and above your legal training? And that's why we were keen for the Law Society to engage and roll out some targeted training to their membership to try and help these, I suppose they're gatekeepers, for want of a better word, to understand more and then be able to spot the signs, and then what can they do about it. So I don't think you do this once, though. I think you have to keep supporting people to understand how exploitation can happen and be alert to the signs and understand what to do about it.
It has to be a sustained
effort
to raise awareness of it.
So the domestic abuse conference that I believe we hope to see in the summer, I know that there's a desire, I think, to include aspects of financial abuse and elder abuse in that forum as well.
They're looking to focus on coercion and control, so it fits absolutely into that category.
I think we'll move on to you now.
Okay.
just move on to the prison capacity questions, if that's okay. So, Mr. Davies, back in April 2025, you told the committee that at that point in time, the prison is currently at 160 people at unlock when capacity is normally at 143. And you said that the department was looking at a range of options to aid capacity issues in the prison, including tagging disposals rather than custodial, and an additional wing for the prison. Subsequent to that, the department published its 25-26 plan, which stated that a prison and probation accommodation strategy has been approved, with work underway to explore feasibility of housing options, and it had a completion date of January 2026 to complete those feasibility options. So, what are you up to?
We've got a range of feasibility options. We're just waiting for some final designs to be pulled together. We are looking, I think we started off with can we just build a new wing on the prison? But the reality is that we house such a complex estate, and we think that there is probably a need to extend the prison but also provide other accommodation for people moving on out of prison. At the minute, the bail hostel accommodation, which we doubled the capacity of 6 years ago, is now full regularly. We know that we have at the minute just under 50 people on remand, and we also know that we have a number of female prisoners, and the outcomes for female prisoners are particularly poor in custodial settings. So we have commissioned an architect from the UK who has done a number of other prisons in smaller jurisdictions, and they are currently drawing up the plans. So the feasibility and the strategy, the strategy document is complete. We hope to conclude the feasibility by the probably mid-March now. It's slightly delayed from January just because of the extra information we got meant that we really needed to focus on not just an extra wing on the prison to accommodate people, but looking at the type of people we have in the prison estate and whether we can better house them in different accommodation. So Jerby is your traditional custodial setting, but there are other alternatives for either reduced risk offenders or people moving on. So that project is underway. It's moving really well. The strategy is really, really good. It's data based, and we've got a good plan for what we want to achieve.
So I'm assuming then, based on what you're saying, that what you'll be bringing to Tynwald won't be a business case and a funding request for an additional wing on the prison. It will be a business case and a funding request for a range of options
for
to tackle
a 10-year accommodation strategy for the prison.
Right, okay. And do you have any idea of when you're intending to bring that forward to Tynwald?
We hope before July 2026.
Okay, it's quite ambitious. Given that is your long-term approach to dealing with the issues you have, what work are you undertaking and what's going on right now in order to manage that additional capacity? Because obviously those prisons are still there, you still have capacity at the prison. What's happening now, and what are you going to do to manage that capacity issue whilst you roll out this accommodation strategy over the next 10 years?
It's probably helpful to bring the governor in at this stage to talk about what he's doing on an operational basis on a day-to-day.
I mean, on a day-to-day basis, obviously we've had people that do meet the criteria for the lower category of the prison that can go out to work on RDR, which is what we call resettlement day release. At one stage during the height of the the population rise, we had in the region of 14 people out in the community working. You will know that the additional accommodation that we have, that we call Juliet Wing, that is for the low-risk prisoners that have trusted jobs around the prison establishment, and those that go out to work as well, and they live in that temporary accommodation that is suitable. There have been talk out there that it's not fit, but these were pods that we researched that were used in the UK in a lot of prisons, as you're aware of the prison population rise where they nearly hit 90,000, and these were used all over, and the research that went into that. So they do meet the criteria for low risk prisoners, which are those that we are risk assessing for working in the community and obviously key areas within the prison. We've recently looking at the tagging, as you're well aware, and that has been tested, but there's a bit of work to be done around that, so we can look at the tagging as an alternative as well. As the chief officer has said, we are looking at alternatives. It's not just prisons that have long-term sentences, those that are going back out in the community, and certainly from a parole aspect, You know, they like to see that we have tested prisoners going back into the community in terms of defensible decisions and can they be trusted. So, you know, that work's ongoing. And certainly on a daily basis, you know, I meet regularly with the Chief Constable just to see what's coming downstream and is that going to affect the population pressure. But as it stands now, the measures and the support which I've had from the department, we are managing, but it's not sustainable without some other options, you know, that the chief officer has talked about, and we're working towards
You
those.
say it's not sustainable. I appreciate that in the long term, but how long can the situation be sustained for? Because obviously the Minister will have to come to Tynwald and ask for all sorts of approval. It's got to go through the Treasury process. Treasury notoriously are not quick at making decisions. They're not a big fan of spending significant money when it comes to capital expenditure. You know, this situation you're in is going to have to be sustained for some time. It isn't going to be fixed overnight.
So maybe just to help on that, with the funding, I mean, we did get the funding quite quickly for the temporary accommodation. So I think it is understood that the need to make some change is very important and needs to be prioritised. So all the data tells us that. So it is absolutely evidence-based. But in terms of managing, I mean,
again, we've talked about an alternative. 2 weeks ago we tested the tagging, and that'll be alternative. As the chief officers illustrated, you know, we've got 50 plus on remand. So, you know, are some of those low risk that can be still managed in the community? One, if they are in work, they can keep their work. Another key thing is keeping their accommodation. So there's a piece of work around that, and there's all those different caveats that we'll look at that can obviously sustain the current position that we're in.
Okay, it's probably fair to say as well that having high population levels in the prison impacts on other aspects of the work that you undertake.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I'd just like to ask about. In the August update to the action plan response to the inspection, one of the priority concerns was that newly arrived male prisoners were held in conditions that were unnecessarily intrusive and restrictive. Regardless of risk, prisoners were subject to 30-minute observation with constant video monitoring over 24 hours, and they were also kept locked up excessively in their early days at the prison. That was the priority concern that was raised. The response to that was to introduce a new policy around what you called a custody care plan, including early days in custody policy. That was originally proposed in September 2023. It was delayed to August 24. It was then delayed again to December 2025. And the most recent update says again that the delivery date was delayed due to operational demands and high population levels. And now it looks like the early days in custody policy has been put on hold completely. That's what the update says that has happened. So you've got a recommendation in here that was a priority concern about people being locked up for unnecessarily long periods of time. That was 3 years ago. And as at today, the response from the department is our response has been put on hold while we deal with our population issues. Can you outline what the actual response is? Is this issue still ongoing today in the prison? Has it been addressed? And if not, how long will it take before these things are actually
I would
resolved?
argue against that it's not been addressed.
Okay.
The policy may not have been finished or comes to its conclusion because there's a big piece of work there to be done. The day-to-day stuff of running the prison has to come as a priority, and certainly the constant questions we get about time on locked and everything else. So in terms of that, you know, prisoners are spending a lot more time on lock depending on the staffing levels that we have to unlock the prison in a safe way and being able to operate in a operating mode during the day state. So I would, you know, argue that we are unlocking prisoners. They are getting their induction. Now, as a result of the population, we are actually doing that induction on the wings where we had a Pacific unit where we was doing that. But you know, there are checks and balances in place to make sure prisoners are getting their induction. You know, I walk around most days, and certainly if there are gripes or complaints, they'll certainly target me and say this or X or Y Z hasn't happened. However, I am confident that we are getting more time out of cell. I think the Minister and the Chief Officer have talked about the quarterly meetings where I go through a process of looking at what we've done for that quarter, how long prisoners have been locked up for a period of time. There are times where prisoners have to be locked up because we don't have, you know, enough staff on the ground for a variety of reasons. You know, we talked about the complexities of some of the prisoners coming in now, and obviously emergency escorts, or there's been an incident where we've had to deal with that, and we have to use the staff that are available to us on the day that could impact on the way the regime is run. But our ultimate aim is for unlock up to an average of 6 hours per day. If there's an evening duty, that's over 8 hours. But even when we have a restricted regime, we are, offering education, association, and people are going to activities and workshops.
I think we'll get into some of the more detail in a private session later, but just in respect of this priority concern around newly arrived prisoners, just to summarise what you said, you don't have a formal early days in custody policy, but you sort of have a workaround.
We have a policy, but what I think HMIP recommended, it needs to be a lot more. You talked about intrusive and people being observed with cameras. Those have all been removed. I mean, those are HMIP recommendations that were made soon after they left. On their return to see how we were progressing, all that, we had obviously followed that process. Certainly the document in terms of the policy, first night in custody, which is a key element in terms of prisoners coming into prison, that's work in progress, but there is a process in place to still put prisoners through, a first night.
So
for the first 72 hours, they're observed. It's a traumatic time coming into prison for the first time. For the first 72 hours, there are measures in place to assess them, even if it's not their first time in prison.
So you think if HMIP came back and did an unannounced visit in the near future, they'd be reasonably satisfied with the progress that you've made in respect to
I would
this?
be comfortable. I wouldn't be happy that we've got it over the line, but I would be comfortable that we've made significant progress, and what I would be able to demonstrate that we are moving to where we need to be in terms of to satisfy them as part of the HMIP expectations.
And I think just to add, one of the aspects of the update is the risk assessment exists in paper form, but it needs to be computerised. So and absolutely one of the interesting things about any inspection is you can be doing great work, but the inspectorate will expect to see all of the process properly mapped and documented. So I think the comfort the department takes from when the governor is reporting is that things have changed on the ground and work is going on around the actual updating and capture of all the policy documentation, which is important. It really is, because that's going to sustain the future as well.
You talked a little bit about having talked to the chief constable, and you have an ongoing dialogue. And what does that collaborative approach look like?
I would say that he's just giving me an update on what may be coming, my way in terms of some of the work he's probably doing. And he doesn't really elaborate on that much, but we just meet, on a quarterly basis just to see, how things are looking, and some of the prisoners that have come in and everything else like that. Certainly one of the things we looked at recently was those that have been released in terms of that, and is any probability that some of those are on the radar again.
Does he also cite concerns with the volume of individuals that might well be coming through?
Sorry?
Does he also talk about the volume of individuals that might well be coming through?
He looks at that, but you can never, calculate how that would look once they've been through the courts.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the remand numbers will tell you, where we are, to be fair.
And there was a 55% increase in workload in the area of sex offences. What concerns do you have around sex offences and the domestic abuse legislation then being implemented, and the amount of individuals that you have coming through that might relate to either of
Well, you can see
those
the fruits
areas?
of the labour, can't you, in terms of where we are as a population now. As before, when I looked at stats, it was mostly around drugs. A lot of it is historical sexual offences now. I previously spoke there with regards to the induction, which we used to do in one specific place. As a result of that, I have additional numbers have to house elsewhere, because the numbers that are in that particular area have overflowed, and they have to be kept separately from the rest of your prison population. So that tells its own story. And certainly looking ahead, and certainly I'm in contact with my counterparts in Jersey and Guernsey, and Jersey did the same exercise, and we're at that point now.
I think it's important to say as well that the prison has increased its capacity to deal with complex sex offenders and domestic abusers. So we now have forensic psychologists in the prison, which historically we didn't have. And they're not cheap, but they provide real value in terms of managing offenders' risk and also trying to deal with their offending behaviours.
Is that sort of in terms of interventions?
Yep.
Absolutely, interventions, single and group interventions.
'Cause I know that there was like some there's an intervention consultancy that
Correct.
was in the present at one point, maybe a few years ago. Is that something that's sort of continued then?
No, there's a
It's changed completely. The
Yeah,
forensic psychologists.
Just
actually
forensic
come in.
psychologists now as
I mean,
opposed to the
group
app.
work for sex offenders has never been, I'm not saying it's never been done, but certainly here on the island, where they sit in a group and talk about that and what led them to it. And, you know, there's been some very good feedback on that.
And we're also developing our own in-house forensic psychologist, so we're putting somebody through the training. So we'll have a local person who's able to work in the prison themselves, which is really positive.
Thank you.
So before we draw this session to a close, is there anything else you'd like to tell us that we've not asked you about?
Well, I could talk all day about this department because I have
Go
great
into
passion
private,
for the department's work. But no, I mean, I'm conscious that you do want to have a session in private, particularly with the prison governor. So one thing I would like to put on record, though, is I would like to put on record very firmly my huge thanks to all the service heads. I mean, the prison governor is with us, but all the service heads do remarkable work, as do all the people who work in the services, but also to the chief officer and all the staff in Home Affairs HQ, which is a small but wonderfully formed team and that do an immense amount of work as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, and we will now sit in private.